I think
listening to your introductory piece there, it's very important to make the distinction between the two bodies of law that would apply here. The law relating to the use of force, so the use of force to begin with, and then the justifiability of particular uses of force within that context of a war. So in the first would be the law relating to the use of force, and the second is the law of war, the international humanitarian law. And I mention this because, of course, the self-defense argument that Israel is using is really an argument that goes to the first body of law that I've mentioned, the law relating to the use of force. So when a state is attacked by another state, in principle, that state has a right to resort to self-defense. And the force that it uses in self-defense should be necessary and proportionate. Now, let me just say, as far as that's concerned, that it's not completely clear to what is the scope of that right in relation to the use of force in self-defense against a non-state actor. Having said that, of course, the UN Security Council did recognise that there is such a right in principle following the 9/11 attacks. So let's say that Israel does have such a right. Then the question becomes, how does it actually operationalise the use of force within that context? And this is where the allegations of war crimes occur. Now, the violation of the law relating to the use of force could itself be a war crime, and that would be the war crime of aggression. And then there could also be other war crimes, and your journalist mentioned a few of those, such as indiscriminate attacks, the use of human shields, collective punishment, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so you've put that very nicely into context for us. So let me put one of those points to Amos Giora. The Hamas rocket attacks are deplorable, but do the scale of those attacks and the impact that they have actually amount to an armed attack on Israel?
I think that if we go back over the past 3 years and we think that over 6,000 Qassam and Guard missiles have been fired into Israel after the Israel. But it's also important to know the rockets were being fired before that. But in terms of post-disengagement, 3 years, 6,000 missiles, I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the perpetrators of this, the initiators of this, is Hamas. And I think that Israel is fully within the country's rights in any way you want to look at self-defense in terms of responding.
Fred Abrams, when we look at the issue of self-defense, many argue that Israel itself didn't abide by the 6-month truce, that they did not ease the 18-month blockade of Gaza. And then on November 4th, Israel actually raided the Gaza Strip and killed a Palestinian, which led Hamas to retaliate with rocket fire. So you could argue that it can't be self-defense if Israel provoked Hamas.
Well, so far I agree with both of your... I agree with both of your guests because there's a distinction.
Fred Abrahams, if you could just let Fred Abrahams answer that question, I'll come to you in just a moment.
Sure. Absolutely, please.
There's a key distinction between the jus in bellum and jus ad bellum and jus in bello, which is, the reasons you go to war and then how you behave in war. And the first of those is really not Human Rights Watch's issue. We don't take positions on whether states on acts of aggression and whether states have the right to self-defense. So, in answer to your question, I mean, we can go back and forth on who broke it. Well, did they really lift the siege, the blockade of Gaza? Did Israel or did Hamas violate the truce by launching these attacks? Our concern is the behavior of the parties in this conflict, and there's no question Hamas is violating the laws of war by launching these Qassam and Grad rockets.
But from a humanitarian perspective,
they have no targeting mechanisms,
it's a dire situation in the Gaza Strip, is it not?
Civilian areas. It could constitute a war crime. And at the same time, whatever Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups do does not, in no way does it justify violations of the law of war that are committed by Israel. And we're seeing a very serious pattern and consistent reports now about indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks, as well as some other issues, potentially the targeting of medical teams.
From a humanitarian perspective, the situation in Gaza is dire, is it not?
the humanitarian situation, we are in a humanitarian crisis even before this began. 18 months of the blockade with restrictions on electricity and fuel, which has affected the water sewage, the sewer pumping system. There was a humanitarian crisis prior to this. Right now, we're in a humanitarian catastrophe. And so, this is all not only civilian protection needs and in relation to the humanitarian law violations, but simply people who need electricity, water, clean sewage. I mean, I can't understate the degree of the emergency at this point.
Avril McDonald, even if the self-defense argument does apply, though the facts on the ground might suggest that argument is very far-fetched, under international law, Israel's use of force must be proportionate, yet over 900 Palestinians have now been killed.
The fact is, really, you can spend hours arguing about whether or not, Israel was who started it, it's irrelevant in a sense. Once the conflict has begun, then the laws of war will regulate the use of violence within that situation. And the question of the proportionality of the use of force arises under both bodies of law. Let's just leave to one side then the use ad bellum, the law relating to the use of force. Israel, to some extent, is misleading the public by trying to conflate these two bodies of law and by suggesting that, because it's acting in self-defense, assuming it is, that it's able to use the level and type of force that it is using within the laws of war. And, those are two entirely separate bodies of law. I am not on the ground. I cannot make an assessment as to what is actually happening. But my sense from what I read in the news is that both parties to this conflict are committing violations of international humanitarian law through, in the case of Hamas, certainly the use of human shields, the complete disregard for the lack of the principle of distinction, and so forth. And Israel as well is committing war crimes.
Let me put that point about a disproportionate use of force